She kept her sleeves rolled down in August. That was the first thing Cassian Veyron noticed about his new assistant. Not her face, not her resume, not the way her hands trembled slightly when she set his coffee on the desk. Just that. Long sleeves, 92 degrees outside, the air conditioning barely keeping up, and Alara Quinn arrived every single morning dressed like she was hiding something underneath all that fabric. He told himself it wasn't his business. He was wrong. If this story already has you gripping your seat, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. And the city didn't sleep. That was something people said about New York, about Chicago, about every overcrowded metropolitan sprawl that had convinced itself it was the center of the known universe. But Dunmore was different. Dunmore didn't sleep because Dunmore was afraid of what happened in the dark. And the thing that happened in the dark had a name. Cassian Veyron. He was 34 years old, and he had been running the Veyron syndicate since he was 26, when his father collapsed from a stroke mid-sentence during a board meeting and never recovered enough to finish the thought. Cassian had stepped into that vacuum without ceremony, without eulogy, without a single visible moment of grief. Within 18 months, he had consolidated 3 rival operations under one roof, restructured the legitimate side of the empire into a real estate and logistics conglomerate worth somewhere north of $4 billion, and earned a reputation so precise and so cold that even the federal task force assigned to watch him had started referring to him in their internal memos as the architect. He built things. He also dismantled them. Sometimes the same thing in the same week. His office occupied the top floor of the Veyron Tower, 42 stories above street level, and from the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see most of the financial district laid out below him like a circuit board, all glittering nodes and dark channels. He spent a lot of time looking out those windows. It was the only thing he did that could be described as contemplative, because contemplation implied uncertainty, and Cassian Veyron was not a man who advertised uncertainty. He was, however, a man who noticed things. The executive assistant position had been vacant for 6 weeks before Alara Quinn walked in. His previous assistant, a meticulous 40-year-old named Marcus, who had worked for the Veyron organization for 11 years, had retired to care for his mother in Portugal. The agency had sent 17 candidates. Cassian had dismissed 16 of them inside the first 10 minutes of their interviews, not for any single disqualifying reason, but for the accumulation of small signals, the way one woman touched her hair too often when she answered questions, the way a man's eyes drifted toward the paintings on the wall rather than holding Cassian's gaze, the way another candidate laughed too readily, performing ease she didn't possess. Cassian did not need an assistant who performed. He needed someone who functioned, someone quiet enough to disappear when he needed silence and present enough to anticipate before he had to ask. Alara Quinn had walked in on a Tuesday morning carrying a leather portfolio that had seen better years and wearing a white long-sleeved blouse buttoned precisely to the wrist. It was the middle of July. The temperature outside was climbing past 90. She sat down across from his desk, placed the portfolio on her knees, and looked directly at him. Not at the room, not at the view, at him. "You already read the file," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I read every file." "Then you know I haven't done this kind of work before." "Corporate executive assistant at Harlan Financial for 3 years qualifies." "Harlan Financial is a mortgage company with 40 employees," she said. "This is—" She stopped, looked at him again, steadier than before. "This is something different." "Yes," he said. "It is." "I still want the job." He hired her that afternoon. What he didn't tell her, what he told himself he was filing under operational awareness rather than anything more complicated, was that the moment she had looked directly at him instead of away, something had shifted very slightly in the architecture of his attention. Not desire, not yet. Something quieter and more difficult to name, something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. He kept his sleeves rolled up, always. She kept hers rolled down. He noticed the contrast on her first day and cataloged it and moved on, because he moved on from things. It was what he did. The first 3 months were unremarkable in the ways that mattered and quietly remarkable in the ways that didn't. Alara learned fast. She absorbed the rhythm of his days within 2 weeks, when he needed silence, when he needed information delivered with the absolute minimum of preamble, which calls to screen and which to patch through immediately, regardless of the hour. She made no errors with scheduling. She caught a discrepancy in a contract proposal from a development partner on her fourth week and flagged it without drama, slipping a single handwritten note under the contract page that said only, Clause 14.3, numbers don't reconcile with Annex B. He'd checked. She was right. The discrepancy was either a mistake or a test, and it didn't much matter which because both possibilities had the same implication. Their development partner was either sloppy or dishonest. He terminated the relationship. He didn't tell Ilara why. She didn't ask. That restraint impressed him more than the note itself. She was efficient, composed, and utterly opaque about her personal life in a way that would have been unusual if Cassian himself hadn't cultivated the exact same quality in every professional interaction he'd ever had. She arrived early, left on time, took a 30-minute lunch at her desk, and never lingered after hours to make small talk or position herself for favorable notice. She had no interest in being noticed. He noticed anyway. The sleeves were the thing. They nagged at him with the low-grade persistence of a sound you can't quite locate. Not sharp enough to demand immediate attention, but present enough that it never fully receded. She wore long sleeves in July. She wore long sleeves in August when the building's air conditioning unit had a maintenance shutdown for 3 days, and the office temperature climbed to something uncomfortable, even for the staff on the lower floors. She wore long sleeves on a Thursday in late August when the heat broke a record, and Cassian had watched her carry a stack of folders from the copy room to the conference room and seen the faint shine of perspiration at her temple. He'd been in a meeting when she walked past. He'd been mid-sentence. He'd finished the sentence, but he'd also tracked her across the room with his peripheral vision, cataloging the blouse, pale blue that day, cotton, buttoned precisely at the wrist, and the way she moved with deliberate care. Nothing hurried, nothing loose. People who moved like that either had exceptional self-discipline or were protecting something. He filed it. He didn't act on it. Not yet. Come. The event that changed everything was small. It was so small that in a different life, under different circumstances, it would have been nothing at all. A flicker of movement in a room full of movement, unremarkable to anyone not paying very close attention. Cassian was paying very close attention. It was a Monday in September, early. The executive floor was quiet, most of the staff not yet arrived. Cassian had been in since 5:30, reviewing a property acquisition proposal that his legal team had marked for urgent attention. And he'd been at the window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand when he heard Ilara's keycard scan at the outer door. He didn't turn around. He knew her footsteps by then. The particular cadence of them, measured and deliberate, slightly muffled by the carpet runner in the corridor. He heard her settle at her desk, heard the quiet sound of her bag being set down, heard the startup chime of her computer. Then he heard his office door open without a knock. He turned then, because Ilara Quinn always knocked. It was one of approximately 4 inviolable habits she'd established in 3 months of working for him, and violations of pattern were data. She was standing in the doorway. She had a folder in her hand, weekly briefing documents, he understood, the ones she compiled herself from the reports that came in over the weekend. She was looking at him, and there was something compressed in her face that he couldn't immediately classify. "I have the Sunday reports," she said. Her voice was level, entirely level, which was itself a signal, because a voice that level required effort. "Bring them in." She crossed to his desk, set the folder down. He watched her hand as she released it, watched the way her wrist turned, and for just one fraction of 1 second before she pulled the sleeve down by instinct, he saw the edge of something on the inside of her wrist. Discoloration. Purple-green, the specific color of a bruise in its 3rd or 4th day. She pulled the sleeve down, precise, practiced. The motion was so fluid it was almost invisible. It had been practiced into invisibility. Cassian said nothing. He picked up the folder. "Thank you," he said. "Close the door on your way out." She did. He stood at his desk and held the folder and didn't open it, and felt something move through his chest that was not clean or comfortable. It was the opposite of clean. It was something that tasted like anger, and something else he was less willing to name, something that had to do with the color of that bruise and the practiced fluency of the movement that had hidden it, which meant this was not the first time she had hidden it, which meant he stopped the chain of logic right there, not because the conclusion was wrong, but because he needed to sit with the premise before he touched the conclusion. Someone had hurt her. Not once. The way she'd pulled that sleeve down was not the movement of someone concealing a single injury. It was muscle memory. It was a reflex so deeply grooved it had become automatic. He opened the folder, read the first page, retained none of it. He spent 48 hours running the situation through the filter of restraint. This was not his business. He employed Alara Quinn in a professional capacity. Her personal life was her own. He had no right, no standing, and frankly no precedent for involving himself in the private circumstances of his staff. He had not built this organization by confusing sentiment with strategy. He had survived 20 years in this world by maintaining the absolute clarity of the line between what was his and what was not. She was not his. He repeated this to himself with some frequency over those 48 hours and found it increasingly unconvincing. By Wednesday morning, the restraint had calcified into something else, into a cold, methodical fury that he was keeping very carefully banked because he didn't yet know where to direct it. He needed information before he could act. He was always most dangerous when he was patient, and he was being very patient. He called Lev Sorin into his office on Wednesday at 7 a.m. Lev was his head of internal security, former military intelligence, a laconic Ukrainian-American who communicated primarily in single sentences and had never, in 6 years of service, asked Cassian a question that wasn't strictly operational. "I need a background pull," Cassian said. "Alara Quinn, current residence, household composition, financial situation, everything recent." Lev looked at him for a moment. "How deep?" "Deep enough to understand what her home situation looks like." "Timeline?" "Today." Lev left without another word. The report was on Cassian's private laptop by 2 in the afternoon. He read it at his desk with the door locked and the blinds turned against the late afternoon light. Alara Quinn, 28 years old, shared an apartment in the Claridge district with her younger sister Maya Quinn, 19, currently enrolled at Dunmore Community College. Their mother had died when Alara was 17, Maya 12. Their father, Dennis Quinn, had a separate address, a small house in the Eastbridge neighborhood that was mortgaged twice over and registered against several outstanding debts to private lenders. The private lenders. Cassian read the names of the lending entities and his eyes stopped moving for a moment. 2 of those names were holding companies, shell structures. He knew them, not because they were his, they weren't, but because he knew the organizational topology of every significant financial predator operating in Dunmore. And these 2 shells traced back through 3 layers of incorporation to the Veyron family's secondary portfolio, specifically to Ronan Veyron. Cassian set the laptop down. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and sat very still for a long moment. Ronan, his cousin, 10 years younger. A man Cassian had spent years managing the way you manage something volatile and fundamentally unpredictable, with distance, with controlled exposure, with the constant background calculation of where and when the volatility would next find an outlet. Dennis Quinn had borrowed money from Ronan Veyron's lending operations. Of course he had. That was precisely the kind of desperation that Ronan's operations fed on. Men with gambling problems, men whose pride was bigger than their resources, men who made bad decisions and then worse decisions and eventually found themselves in a hole that Ronan Veyron was very happy to measure and then bury them in. Alara had taken this job because of her father's debts. She was working for the Veyron organization, working for Cassian, because her family was in financial bondage to a Veyron, to Ronan. The bruise on her wrist was the shape of fingers. Cassian understood exactly what that meant. He stood up. He walked to the window. He looked at the city below him, and he breathed slowly through the thing building in his chest because he needed to be cold right now and not hot. Hot was for men who were less disciplined. He could not afford heat. Not yet. He called Lev back in. "Find out Ronan's schedule for the rest of the week," he said, "particularly any overlap with my office building." Lev's expression did not change. "Understood." Thursday came. Alara arrived at 7:45, same as always. She was wearing a gray blouse, long-sleeved, buttoned precisely, a shade darker than the overcast sky outside. She looked tired. Not the surface tiredness of someone who hadn't slept well, but the deeper kind. The kind that lived behind the eyes. The kind that came from holding something heavy for a long time. Cassian watched her at her desk through the glass partition that separated his office from the outer space and made a decision that had probably been made sometime before this morning, if he was being honest with himself, which he increasingly was. He pressed the intercom. "Come in, please." She looked up, came through the door with a notepad, expecting directives, expecting work. She stood across from his desk in the professional posture she always held, spine straight, pen ready, and waited. "Put the notepad down," he said. A beat. She set it on the corner of the desk. "Sit down." Something moved across her face, too fast to catch cleanly, but present. She sat. Cassian leaned back in his chair. He looked at her, and he kept his voice entirely neutral, which required more effort than it usually did. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that however you answer, it doesn't affect your employment here. That's not a qualifier. That's a fact. Do you understand?" She looked at him. "Yes." "Are you all right?" The question hung in the air between them. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. He counted, and then something shifted in her face. Something very small, like a crack forming in a surface that had been keeping enormous pressure contained. "I'm fine," she said. "That's the answer you give other people," he said. "I'm asking what the actual answer is." She was quiet. "Elara." He said her name without inflection. Just the name, grounded and direct. "Show me your wrists." The color left her face. She sat very still for a moment. Then, slowly, because she was someone who processed decisions before making them, she reached up with both hands and unfastened the buttons at both her cuffs. She folded the sleeves back. He looked. It was worse than he'd expected, which meant he hadn't expected enough. The bruise on the left wrist was the one he'd seen. Finger-shaped, purple-green. A human grip impressed into her skin. But there were older marks too, fainter, yellowing. And there was something on her right forearm, higher up. A linear bruise, the kind you got when someone grabbed and twisted. She sat across from him with both her arms exposed on the desk in front of her, and she was not looking at him. She was looking at the window, at the gray sky, and her jaw was set so hard he could see the muscle working. He said nothing for a moment. "Who?" he said. "It doesn't matter." "Who?" She turned and looked at him then, and her eyes were dry, which somehow was worse than if they'd been wet. "If I tell you, you'll make it worse." "Tell me." "Mr. Veyron." "Cassian." It came out sharper than he intended. He pulled it back. "Tell me." She looked at him for a long moment. And then, with the particular resignation of someone who has run out of options for protecting other people, she said, "Ronan." The room went very quiet. Cassian sat with that word. Ronan. His blood, his problem, his organization's money in Dennis Quinn's pocket, his cousin's hands on this woman's wrists. He picked up his coffee. He set it back down without drinking it. He looked at Elara Quinn sitting across from him with her sleeves rolled back and bruises on both arms, and something that he could only describe as the specific dignity of someone who has endured more than they should have had to. "When?" he said. 3 weeks ago was the most recent time. She pulled her sleeves back down. Precise. Practiced. "He came to see my father. I was there. She stopped. "I told him he needed to renegotiate the terms. He didn't appreciate that." "What exactly did he do?" "He made it clear that the debt was his to manage however he chose." Her voice was flat, informational, like she was reporting a number. "And that the collateral included whatever he decided the collateral was." Cassian heard the particular way she said that sentence and understood everything it contained. "He said that to you?" "Yes." "In front of your father?" "Yes." He stood up from the desk because sitting still was no longer a viable option. He walked to the window. Outside, the city was moving, cars and pedestrians and the mechanical hum of a place that didn't stop, that had never stopped, that would keep going regardless of any individual catastrophe happening within it. "Does he know you work here?" Cassian said to the window. "Yes." "Did he tell you to take this job?" Silence. He turned around. She was looking at her hands, folded in her lap. "He suggested it, when the debt got large enough. He said it would be beneficial, for my father's situation." "He placed you here." "I took the job because I needed it," she said, and there was a hard edge in her voice for the first time, not defensive, but clarifying. Whatever his reasons were, I had my own. He looked at her. I know, he said, and he meant it. He sat back down. He looked at her across the desk, and he made a series of calculations very quickly, which was what he did, which was what he had always done, except this time the calculations had a different texture than they usually did. They were less clean. They were threaded through with something personal, and personal was a variable he was not accustomed to carrying. I'm going to speak with Ronan, he said. Her expression changed immediately. Don't. Elara, please. The word was quiet and urgent and entirely uncharacteristic from someone who asked him for nothing. If you do this, my father's debt doesn't go away. It gets worse. Ronan doesn't respond to being confronted the way other people do. He escalates. I know how Ronan responds, Cassian said. I've been managing him for 8 years. Then you know that going after him directly will make my family's situation worse, not better. And if I don't go after him directly, he said carefully, how many more times does he put his hands on you? She had no answer for that. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded. He watched her face, the compression of it, the effort required to maintain composure, and underneath that effort, something else that he recognized because he had felt it himself. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been solving everyone else's problems for so long, they no longer know how to ask for help with their own. I'm going to handle this, he said. I need you to trust me enough to let me do that. She looked at him for a long time. Why? It was a good question. It was, in fact, exactly the right question, and he had been asking it himself for approximately 48 hours. Because it needs to be handled, he said. She didn't look satisfied with that answer. She didn't look unsatisfied with it either. She looked like someone trying to determine whether the ground under her feet was solid. Go back to your desk, he said. Finish the morning work. I have a call at 10 that I'll need you to sit in on. She stood. She picked up the notepad. She walked to the door. Elara. She stopped but didn't turn. The debt your father owes, he said. Starting today, it doesn't exist. I'll handle the paperwork. He heard her breathing change from across the room, just slightly, the compression of it. That's not... She stopped. Started again. You can't just... It's a number, he said. Numbers are what I do. She stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she left. Ronan Veyron arrived at the executive floor at 2:17 in the afternoon, unannounced, which was the kind of thing Ronan did because it amused him to remind people that certain doors opened for him, regardless of the protocols posted on the other side of them. He was 24 years old and had his grandfather's jaw and his father's temper, and approximately none of the self-control that had made the Veyron name mean something. He was also, at 2:17 on a Thursday afternoon, visibly drunk. Not stumbling, but loose in the way that expensive alcohol made certain people loose. A general softening of the edges, a broadening of the grin, an amplitude in the gestures that didn't belong in this building. Elara was at her desk when he came through the outer door. Cassian was watching through the glass partition. He watched Ronan stop at her desk, watched his cousin lean one hand on the edge of it, watched the body language of that lean, proprietorial, deliberately invading the boundary of her space. He watched Elara's spine go very straight, watched her face go carefully neutral, the practiced blankness of someone managing a threat they've managed before. Cassian was already at his office door before Ronan said a word. He came through the glass partition into the outer office and stood 6 feet from his cousin's back and said, very quietly, Ronan. Ronan turned. The grin was still there. Cass. He spread his hands in a gesture of casual welcome, as though this were his space and Cassian the visitor. I was just saying hello to... Come into my office. I'm in the middle of... Now. The word was not loud. It didn't need to be loud. Something in Ronan's grin shifted. A recalibration. A read of the temperature in the room. He was impulsive and reckless, but he was not entirely without instinct. He pushed off the desk, straightened his jacket. Sure, he said. Fine. Cassian held the door open. Ronan walked through. Cassian followed and closed the door. The room was very quiet. Cassian walked to his desk but didn't sit behind it. He stood to the side of it, which changed the geometry of the room in a specific way. It removed the formality of the desk as a barrier and replaced it with something more personal and considerably more dangerous. "The Quinn girl," Ronan said before Cassian could speak. He was still doing the grin, but it was working harder now. "Don't tell me you've gotten attached. That's not like you." "You put your hands on her." "Cass?" "Don't say my name like that," Cassian said. "Don't say it like we're at a family dinner. You put your hands on my employee. You left marks on her. Say yes or no." The grin faded. Something harder came up under it, younger and uglier. "She got in the middle of a business discussion. Her father's debt is cleared. As of this morning, the number doesn't exist anymore." Ronan stared at him. "You can't just—" "It is done," Cassian said. "What I'm asking you about right now is not the debt. I'm asking you about her wrists." A long silence. Then Ronan shrugged, a short, dismissive roll of his shoulders. "She was interfering. I moved her out of the way." He said it with the specific confidence of someone who has never once been made to account for any of his movements. Something inside Cassian's chest went very cold. He crossed the room in 4 steps and hit Ronan with the flat of his palm across the face, open-handed, not a punch, which meant it was louder than it was painful and also meant it was deliberate, that the humiliation was precisely calibrated. Ronan stumbled sideways, hit the edge of the conference table, caught himself. He turned and his face was red, and the thing in his eyes was pure fury, and underneath that, finally, something like genuine fear. "What the—" "She had bruises on both arms," Cassian said. He was still entirely calm, the calm of deep, still water. "Fingerprints. Weeks old. You've done it before. She's a—" "You will not finish that sentence." Ronan stared at him. Cassian stood in the center of his own office and looked at his cousin and felt the decision settle into place with the particular finality of something that has been building for a long time, finally reaching the form it was always going to take. "You're done," he said, "with the lending operations, with access to this building, with access to anyone or anything connected to this organization. I'll give you 30 days to arrange your affairs." "You can't do that," Ronan said. The fear was more visible now. "The family is going to hear from me directly," Cassian said. "Do you want to be there for that conversation, or do you want to leave this building right now and not come back?" A beat. Ronan's jaw worked. He straightened his jacket again. The gesture had a different quality now. Not casual, but self-protective, reflexive. He looked at Cassian, and something moved across his face that might, in different circumstances, have been called recognition. "This is about her," Ronan said. "You know that's insane. She's an assistant. She's nobody. She is mine to protect," Cassian said. 4 words. Flat and absolute and not spoken as a declaration of possession, but as a declaration of responsibility, which was something different and something Ronan, who had never been responsible for anything, would never fully understand. "And you are never going to touch her again." Ronan left. He didn't slam the door. He closed it quietly, which was somehow worse, which was somehow the version of departure that carried the most threat, because it meant he hadn't accepted. It meant he had simply postponed. Cassian stood in the empty office and listened to the silence settle. Then he opened his door. Elara was at her desk. She was looking at him. Whatever she had heard through the glass, and the walls were thick but not soundproof, was visible in her face as a controlled, careful stillness. He looked at her for a moment. "We need to talk," he said. "Not now. Tonight. Come to the penthouse at 7. She opened her mouth. "It's not a request," he said, and he said it gently, which was a combination he didn't usually attempt. She closed her mouth, nodded once. He went back into his office and closed the door and stood at the window for a long time, looking at the city that belonged to him, thinking about the way Ronan had closed that door, thinking about the calendar and the leverage and the family meeting that was now necessary, and the way Elara Quinn had looked at him when he said, "She is mine to protect." Not with gratitude and not with fear, but with something careful and questioning and very much unresolved. He thought about that look. He was still thinking about it when his phone rang at 6:43 that evening, a number he recognized immediately, a number he had not expected to hear from tonight. It was the internal line for the building's lobby security. Mr. Veyron, the guard said, and the man's voice had a quality Cassian had learned to parse over many years. Controlled, professional, and underneath that control, very tightly contained alarm. We have a situation. Mr. Ronan Veyron has returned to the building. He came through the parking structure. He's... A pause. Sir, he went directly to the lower level. Miss Quinn's car is still in the garage. She hasn't come up yet. Cassian was moving before the guard finished the sentence, and the elevator doors were already closing behind him. And in the space between the 42nd floor and the parking garage, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Something he did not have a word for that wasn't also the most dangerous thing a man in his position could afford to feel. And somewhere below him, in the concrete dark of the garage, Alara Quinn was alone with the worst mistake he had ever allowed to walk freely in his world. The parking garage smelled like oil and concrete, and the particular stale cold that collected in underground spaces regardless of the season. Alara had parked on level 2, same spot she always took. 3rd row, near the stairwell, close enough to an exit that she could be on the street in under a minute if she needed to be. That calculation had not been accidental. She had been making that kind of calculation for longer than she wanted to admit. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps from the far end of the row. Not hurried, which was worse than hurried. Hurried meant panic. Measured meant intent. She stopped walking and turned, and Ronan was coming toward her from the direction of the elevators, still in the same clothes from this afternoon, jacket slightly disheveled now. The looseness in him from the alcohol earlier burned off and replaced by something harder and considerably less manageable. You got him to erase the debt, Ronan said. Not a question. His voice carried in the concrete space, flat and clipped. Whatever you said to him, whatever you did, that money belonged to my operation. I didn't ask him to do anything. She kept her voice level. Her bag was on her right shoulder. Her keys were in her left hand, the longest key between her fingers. That was his decision. Right. He stopped about 8 feet from her. His eyes were very clear now, which was not an improvement over the alcohol looseness. Clear meant calculated. And the conversation he just had with me, that was also his decision. I don't know what he said to you. He's pulling my access, my accounts, 30 days. Ronan's jaw moved. 8 years I've been building those operations. 8 years. And you walk in here with your long sleeves and your sad eyes, and suddenly the man who has never once intervened in my business is rearranging my entire life. Your business involves hurting people, she said. The words came out before she could decide whether they were strategic. That's what you were protecting, your right to hurt people who can't pay fast enough. Something shifted in his face. You don't want to do this, he said. I'm not doing anything. I'm walking to my car. She started moving. He stepped sideways, not blocking her directly, but repositioning. The language of someone who wanted her to know the geometry of the space had changed, that the exit was now a calculation she'd have to make through him rather than around him. He can't protect you every hour, Ronan said. That's the thing about Cassian. He's very good at making decisions, terrible at sustaining attention. There's always a next crisis, always something that requires him more urgently than whatever he promised he'd handle. She stopped. Is that what happened to the others? She said. The other people your lending operation trapped. Did you tell them the same thing, that nobody was going to keep paying attention? I'm telling you a practical truth. You're threatening me in a parking garage. She turned to face him fully. Which tells me that the conversation with Cassian went exactly the way I was afraid it would go, and now you're down here trying to reestablish something you feel like you lost this afternoon. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. You're smarter than he thinks you are, Ronan said. He knows exactly how smart I am. Does he? Ronan tilted his head slightly, and the gesture had something unpleasant in it, something assessing. Because from where I'm standing, you look like a woman who just traded one kind of obligation for another. Cassian doesn't do things without expectation of return. You've been working for him long enough to know that. Don't. I'm just saying, the debt's gone. Wonderful. But now you owe him something that doesn't have a number attached to it, and those are the worst kind. Back up, she said. He didn't. He took a step toward her instead, and it was not a large step, and it was not accompanied by raised hands or any overt gesture of aggression, and that was precisely what made it what it was. A demonstration that he could, that the space between them was his to manage. The elevator behind him opened. Cassian came through the doors at a pace that was not quite running, but was also not anything resembling a normal walk, and the quality of his movement in that moment, the particular economy of it, nothing wasted, nothing performative, made the space in the garage feel suddenly much smaller. Ronan heard it, turned. The three of them occupied a triangle in the concrete half-dark, and nobody said anything for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Cassian looked at Alara. One look, a quick inventory, such checking, she understood, for new damage. He found none. Something in his posture adjusted by a fraction. He looked at Ronan. "Get away from her," he said. "We were talking." "Get away from her." Ronan spread his hands in the gesture from this afternoon, the same casual widening of the arms that said, "I'm being reasonable. Why are you making this difficult?" "I came to say my piece. That's allowed." "In a parking garage," Cassian said, "after I told you to leave this building." "You told me I had 30 days. I told you to leave tonight." Cassian walked forward. Not toward Ronan directly, angled slightly, positioning himself between his cousin and Alara with the specific precision of someone who has done this kind of geometry before, who understands what it means to control a space. "And I'm looking at you standing 8 feet from my employee in an underground garage after hours, and I am making a very significant effort right now to address that calmly." "Cassian," Ronan's voice changed register. Lower, less performative, the voice of a conversation that didn't want witnesses, or would have preferred not to have them. "Listen to me. Whatever this is, whatever you think is happening between you and this woman, you're not seeing it clearly. Say what you're actually trying to say." "She was placed here," Ronan said, "by me, because her father owed me money and I needed visibility into your operation. That was the arrangement. She understood the arrangement." Alara felt the concrete of the sentence land in the space between all three of them and watched Cassian's face for the impact. There wasn't one, not visible, which meant he had already known or had already done the math. She wasn't sure which possibility unsettled her more. "I know why she's here," Cassian said. Ronan blinked. That apparently was not the response he'd prepared for. "She told me, Tessam," Cassian said, "or she didn't have to, because I read the same financial records you think I don't have access to. You used her father's debt to place an asset in my building. You thought I wouldn't notice because you've been doing small things I don't notice for years, and you confuse that tolerance for blindness." He paused. "It wasn't blindness, Ronan. I let those small things go because the cost of addressing them wasn't worth the disruption. This..." He didn't gesture toward Alara, but the word carried her into the sentence anyway. "This changes that calculation entirely." "Mop, yeah." "She's not what you think she is," Ronan said. "She's not what you think she is," Cassian said. "That's the distinction you're missing." "She was reporting to me." "She wasn't," Alara said. Both men looked at her. She met Ronan's eyes. "I never gave you information about this organization. I never gave you anything. You asked me to observe and report, and I took your job offer because my family needed me to, and then I did my job, Cassian's job, and nothing else. Whatever you thought the arrangement was, that was your assumption. I didn't sign a contract with you." "Your father's debt is paid," Cassian said. "We covered this." "It's paid because she worked him," Ronan said, and his voice was edging now, the composure splintering at the seams. "Don't you see that? She came in here and she played quiet and capable and whatever else she needed to play, and now you're erasing 8-figure debt and throwing me out of my own family's—" Cassian hit him. "Not the open palm from this afternoon." A closed fist, fast and precise, landing on the left side of Ronan's jaw and snapping his head sideways and dropping him against the side of Alara's car with a sound that was loud in the enclosed space and then very, very quiet. Ronan slid down the door and caught himself with one hand on the concrete. He stayed there for a moment, not because he was incapacitated, but because the hit had been enough to require a moment of recalibration. Cassian stood over him and his breathing was controlled. Everything was controlled, but his right hand was very slightly flexed at the side. "You don't talk about her like that," Cassian said. "Quiet. Absolute. You don't theorize about her motivations or characterize her behavior or put a frame around her that makes your conduct toward her look like a business decision. You put your hands on her, multiple times, over weeks. That is the only fact that matters in this conversation." Ronan touched his jaw, looked up. There was blood at the corner of his mouth. He looked at it on his fingers and then looked at Cassian, and something in his face completed the shift that had been happening all afternoon. From younger to older, from reckless to something that knew it had pushed past a line and was now calculating the distance back. "This isn't finished," Ronan said. "Yes," Cassian said. "It is." Lev was waiting at the elevator when they came up from the garage, Cassian walking ahead, Alara 2 paces behind, neither of them speaking. Cassian gave Lev a single look that communicated a complete operational directive without a word, and Lev went down to the garage without being asked. They rode up to 42 in silence. The office was empty at this hour. The building's overnight skeleton crew occupied the security station on the ground floor and the server room on the 8th. Up here, there was nothing but the ambient hum of the city filtering through the glass, and the particular quality of quiet that belonged to places where power was exercised during the day and abandoned at night. Cassian led her into his office. He didn't turn on the overhead lights, only the desk lamp, which threw the room into contrasts. Warm circle of yellow, deep shadow at the edges. He went to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of water, set one in front of her, sat across from her. She was looking at her hands on the desk. Her left cuff had ridden up slightly in the garage, and the bruise was visible again, that particular purple-green geography, and she pulled the sleeve down with the practiced motion and then stopped, caught by something, and left it where it was. The bruise on the desk between them. "He wasn't wrong," she said. "About some of it." Cassian looked at her. "I took the job because of the debt," she said. "Ronan suggested it. He made it clear that my father's situation would be better managed if I was present in your organization. He didn't use the word report. He didn't have to. I understood what he was implying." "And what did you decide?" "I decided I needed the job." She looked up. "And then I got here and I did the job. That's all I did. If that reads as playing you, I can't change how it reads. But that's what actually happened." "I know," he said. "You said that earlier, in the garage." "Because it's true." "How?" "Because I know what asset placement looks like," he said. "And I know what someone doing their actual job looks like. You've been doing your actual job. Whatever Ronan thought he was installing in this office, you made a different choice. I noticed that. It was part of why I kept you." She was quiet for a moment. "You were evaluating me," she said. "I was paying attention," he said. "That's different." "Is it?" "Evaluation implies a test with predetermined criteria. Paying attention means you let what's in front of you tell you what it is." He looked at her. "What's in front of me is someone who took an impossible situation and navigated it with more integrity than most people would have." She looked away. The lamp threw shadows across the side of her face. "He's going to come back," she said. "Ronan, you know that." "Yes." 30 days isn't containment." "No," he said. "It's a courtesy I'm extending because he's family, and I'm aware of the limitations of that courtesy." "What happens to my father's situation when Ronan decides the courtesy period is over and he wants to reestablish leverage?" "Your father's situation is managed," Cassian said. "The debt is gone. The lending operation, Ronan's operation, is getting restructured regardless of the 30 days. He just doesn't know the timeline on that yet." She looked at him. "You're dismantling it," she said. "I'm incorporating it into the main portfolio and removing the predatory structures, which I should have done 2 years ago." He said it without apology, which he understood to be its own kind of honesty. Not minimizing the failure, just not performing contrition that cost him nothing. "That's on me. I managed Ronan at a distance and told myself the distance was oversight. It wasn't." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked. People who run things like this don't explain themselves to their assistants." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not my assistant right now. It's 8 o'clock. You're a person in my office who nearly got cornered in a parking garage and deserves to understand what's being done to address the conditions that made that possible." She sat with that. "What do you want me to do?" she said finally. "Going forward, with the job, with my family. Tell me what the—" She stopped. "Tell me what you actually want, not the professional version." The question sat in the air between them, and Cassian held it there and looked at the bruise on her wrist, the one she'd stopped hiding, and said the thing that had been true for longer than tonight. "I want you to stop protecting everyone else long enough to let someone protect you," he said. That's what I want. The job stays, the salary doubles, your father's debts stay gone. Those are practical facts. They don't require you to feel anything about them. And the other part? He said nothing. You said practical facts, she said, which implies Elara. He said her name the same way he'd said it this morning. Grounded, direct, no exit routes. Go home tonight. Let me handle what needs to be handled. Come back tomorrow. We'll talk about the rest when neither of us has adrenaline making the decisions. She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded, stood up, gathered her bag from the chair. She was at the door when she stopped. For what it's worth, she said to the door rather than to him, I knew Ronan's plan wasn't going to work the first week I was here. Why? Because you don't miss anything, she said. And I wasn't willing to be the thing that got missed. She left. He sat in the dark and the lamplight and listened to her footsteps in the hall, and then the distant sound of the elevator, and then nothing. He picked up his phone and called Lev. Ronan's out of the building? He said. Yes, he's being driven home. I put 2 men on his building tonight. And the Quinn family's address? Covered as of 20 minutes ago. Good. He set the phone down, looked at the window. The city's lights made their usual indifferent show against the glass. Pull me everything on Matteo Serrano's current operations. Whatever's moved in the last 60 days. A pause on the line. Is that related to tonight? Lev said. I don't know yet, Cassian said. That's why I want it. He ended the call. The name had surfaced in Ronan's financial records. 1 degree of separation, a shell company with a shared directorship, nothing actionable on its own. But Matteo Serrano was not a name you found in anyone's records by accident. He was careful to the point of compulsion, and the fact that he'd been careless enough, or deliberate enough, to leave a traceable connection to Ronan's operation meant one of 2 things. Either the connection was genuinely accidental, or it was meant to be found. Cassian did not believe in accidents of that particular kind. He was still at his desk at midnight when the first of the files came through, and by the time he reached the third, he understood with the cold clarity of someone reading a map that what was happening was not finished, was not contained, and was considerably larger than a cousin with a drinking problem in a parking garage. Somewhere across the city, in a glass office 3 miles east of the Veyron Tower, something was being set into motion, and it had been in motion for months, quiet and patient, waiting for exactly the kind of family fracture that had erupted today. Waiting for Cassian to look left so it could. The files told a story that Cassian had to read 3 times before he trusted himself to believe it. Not because the information was incomplete, because it was too complete. Because the picture assembled itself with the kind of structural precision that didn't happen organically, that required planning, patience, and a very specific understanding of how Cassian Veyron thought and what it would take to make him look in exactly the wrong direction at exactly the right moment. Matteo Serrano had been building this for 8 months. The Serrano name carried its own history in Dunmore. Older money than the Veyrons, differently sourced, routed through import logistics and port operations rather than real estate. Matteo had inherited the operation from his uncle 4 years ago at 31 and had proceeded to do something none of his predecessors had managed. He had made it quiet. Serrano's name stopped appearing in law enforcement intelligence reports. His organization stopped generating friction with rival groups. He pulled back from visible operations, consolidated, restructured, and for 2 years most of the people who paid attention to such things had quietly concluded that Serrano was either going legitimate or going soft. Cassian had never believed either conclusion. He had simply filed the uncertainty and watched the perimeter. He had not watched closely enough. What the files showed, compiled from financial surveillance, shell company registries, 3 years of intercepted communications that Lev's team had been sitting on without understanding their significance, was a structure so patient it was almost architectural. Serrano had spent 8 months engineering a specific outcome: open warfare between the Veyron organization and the Morelli family. The Morellis controlled the eastern port operations and 2/3 of Dunmore's wholesale distribution network. They were the one organization in the city whose scale was comparable to Cassian's, and for 11 years the two had maintained a functional non-aggression arrangement that benefited both. Not friendship, not alliance, just the mutual recognition that direct conflict would cost more than coexistence. Serrano wanted that arrangement destroyed, The logic was straightforward once you saw it. If Veyron and Morelli went to war, both organizations would bleed resources, personnel, and attention for however long the conflict lasted. Serrano could absorb the vacuum. He could take the port operations that Morelli bled out defending, take the distribution networks that Veyron bled out attacking, and emerge from the smoke of someone else's war as the dominant power in the city. Clean, patient, devastating. All it required was a trigger. Something specific enough to be personal, serious enough to override the 11 years of rational coexistence. Valentina Morelli was 22 years old and the only child of Dominic Morelli, who was famously and without irony the most protective father in the Dunmore underworld. She had her own security detail, her own driver, her own carefully controlled public profile. Abducting her would be the kind of act that could not be de-escalated, could not be explained away, could not survive the application of reason because the emotional charge of it would overwhelm reason entirely. If Valentina Morelli disappeared and evidence placed her inside a Veyron facility, Dominic Morelli would not call Cassian to discuss it. He would move. Cassian read the section of the file twice. Then he called Lev. "Wake up whoever you need to wake up," he said. "I need eyes on every Veyron property in the metro area. Warehouses, storage, anything with a loading dock. Start with the Eastfield complex." Timeline? Now, Lev. He was already on his feet, jacket off the chair, out the door. The call came at 4:23 in the morning. He was in a car heading toward the Eastfield Industrial District when his phone buzzed. Not Lev's number, but a number he recognized after a 3-second delay. The private line for Dominic Morelli's head of security. A man named Aldo Cruz, whom Cassian had met exactly twice, both times at the kind of carefully neutral locations that such meetings required. He answered. "Aldo." "Mr. Veyron?" Cruz's voice was controlled in the way that people controlled their voices when they were containing something large. "I'm calling as a professional courtesy before this goes somewhere it can't come back from." "Tell me." "We found footage," Cruz said. "Security camera from the Eastfield warehouse. Footage from 6 hours ago showing a vehicle registered to your logistics subsidiary pulling into the loading dock. We have partial plate confirmation. We have what appears to be a woman being moved from that vehicle into the facility on foot." Cassian said nothing. "Mr. Morelli has identified the woman as his daughter based on clothing and physical description," Cruz continued. "He is currently making decisions about how to respond. I'm calling you because I've been doing this job for 17 years. And I know what planted evidence looks like, and I'm not yet certain this isn't it. But I need you to tell me, right now on this call, whether Valentina Morelli is in one of your facilities." "She is not," Cassian said. "And she was not placed there by my organization. This is a fabrication. I've spent the last 3 hours reading the file that explains exactly who built it and why." A pause. "You knew this was coming," Cruz said. "I knew something was coming. I didn't know the specific shape of it until tonight." "Mr. Morelli is not going to accept that explanation over footage." "I know. Tell him I need 12 hours. "I can give you 4, Cruz said. "After that, I can't hold him." The call ended. Cassian put the phone in his jacket pocket and looked out the window at the industrial streets passing in the pre-dawn dark. Lev was in the passenger seat. His driver, a man named Theo, who had been with the organization for 9 years and understood that silence was a professional requirement, kept his eyes on the road. "Eastfield," Cassian said. 15 minutes, Theo said. Lev turned from the window. "If she's actually in there, then we find her ourselves and deliver her to her father before Cruz runs out of patience." He looked at Lev. "And if Serrano has people inside that facility waiting for us to show up, we need to be prepared for that. How many do you want?" "Call in 12. Armed. Meet us at the perimeter." Lev was on the phone before Cassian finished the sentence. But the Eastfield warehouse complex was a legitimate logistics operation. 3 interconnected buildings on a 7-acre property in the industrial district east of the financial center. Cassian used it for storage and distribution for the real estate portfolio's physical assets, furniture, fixtures, materials for ongoing development projects. It was managed by a facilities crew of 6 who worked days and locked up at 6 in the evening. At 4:45 in the morning, it should have been empty. It was not empty. They approached from the north access road with headlights off. 2 vehicles. Lev's 12 men spread between them. The perimeter fence was intact. The main gate was locked. But there was a side access point, a service gate on the western edge, that had been cut open and pushed back closed, the cut disguised well enough to pass a casual inspection and fail a close one. Cassian looked at the gate. Someone who knew the facility, Lev said quietly. Someone who had access to our facility records, Cassian said, which narrowed it to the internal organization, or someone with access to internal records, which brought him, with a cold precision that felt like a blade finding a nerve, back to Ronan. Back to the shell company and Ronan's records with the Serrano connection. Back to a man who had motive, access, and nothing left to lose after this afternoon. He kept that calculation in his chest and didn't speak it. We go in through the service gate, he said. Lev, northwest quadrant. I want the loading dock covered and the interior stairwells. Nobody moves without confirmation of position. They went in. Building 2 was where they found her. She was in a secondary storage room on the ground floor, wrists zip-tied to a structural column, a cloth tied over her mouth that she had partially worked loose. She was sitting on the concrete floor with her back against the column and her legs out in front of her, and when the door opened and the flashlight hit her, she flinched violently and then went very still, assessing. She was conscious, unhurt, furious in the specific way of someone who has been efficiently controlled and is running on pure adrenaline and a quality of cold anger that Cassian recognized as a family trait, because Dominic Morelli was a man of precisely that same controlled fury. He crouched down in front of her. Valentina Morelli. She looked at him. Dark eyes, completely alert, gauging. Cassian Veyron, he said. Your father's security chief knows I'm here. You're going home, yes or no, do you understand? She nodded. He pulled the cloth loose from her mouth. Lev cut the zip ties. She stood on her own without assistance and didn't waver, which told him the last several hours had not broken anything, only compressed it. How many of them were there? Cassian said. 3, she said. Her voice was rough but steady. They wore masks. One of them knew the building layout. He knew where the cameras were. Inside knowledge. Yes. She looked at him directly. It wasn't your people who took me. I know that. I saw the vehicle. The plates were wrong. One number was a sticker over the original. You memorized the plate. I memorized everything. She met his eyes. My father taught me to. He stood up, looked at Lev. Get her out. My car, straight to the Morelli residence. I'll call crews on the way. Lev nodded and moved toward Valentina. She went with him without protest, which cost her something. Cassian could see it in the set of her jaw, the particular dignity of someone accepting help while every instinct pushed toward independence. He recognized that quality as well. He followed them out through the service gate and was 3 feet from the car when his phone rang. The screen said, Ilara, home, 4:51 in the morning. He answered immediately. Ilara. There's someone outside. Her voice was low, controlled, the specific register of someone working very hard to stay level. A car. It's been parked across from my building for 40 minutes. I noticed it when I couldn't sleep and... Cassian, the engine ran for a minute and then stopped. It's still there. Where's your sister? Asleep. She doesn't know. Listen to me. Do not turn on lights. Do not go near windows. Lock your bedroom door. There are 2 men in the car. I can see from the... Lock the bedroom door, Ilara. Right now. Tell me when it's done. A pause. The small sound of a door, the soft click of a lock. Done, she said. He was already looking at Lev over the roof of the car. Lev had his own phone out, already moving. 2 men in a vehicle outside Quinn's apartment, Cassian said. Claridge District, 440 North Harlan. He looked at the address in his memory. Get there first. Lev's people were already deploying. Ilara. He kept his voice even. Are you hearing me? Yes. You're going to be fine. I have people 2 minutes out. When someone knocks on your door and says my name, you open it. Not before. A silence. Then, this is connected to tonight. It was not a question. She was fast. She was always fast. Yes, he said. The thing you were looking into. The files. Yes. How bad? He looked at Valentina being helped into his car. At the Eastfield warehouse behind him, with its cut fence and its emptied storage room. At the sky beginning to shade from black toward the deep blue that preceded dawn. Bad enough, he said. We'll talk when you're out of that apartment. Another silence. Longer. Cashin. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before. Not fear, not exactly. Something beneath fear. Something that came from a person who had been managing crisis alone for a long time and was in the specific process of deciding whether to stop doing that. I need you to tell me one thing. Ask. Is my sister safe? Yes, he said. I will make sure of it personally. A breath? Just one, just audible. Okay, she said. Not relief, not quite. Just the sound of a decision landing. He stood in the pre-dawn cold outside his own compromised facility with another man's daughter in his car and his assistant's voice in his ear and the full topology of Serrano's plan finally assembled in his head. Every layer of it, the financial manipulation, the planted evidence, the abduction, and now this, the final pressure point. The message that said, I know what you care about and I can reach all of it simultaneously. And he felt the particular quality of fury that came not from being hurt, but from being read accurately by someone who meant to use that accuracy as a weapon. Serrano knew about Ilara. That meant the surveillance had been running longer than the files showed. That meant the 8 months of documented preparation was the visible layer, and there was something older underneath it, something that had been watching Cashian's office, watching his behavior, identifying the anomaly of a man who controlled everything, allowing himself to care about something he couldn't fully control. Ilara Quinn, with her long sleeves and her precise footsteps, and her integrity intact despite every incentive to compromise it, had been identified as a vulnerability before Cashian had fully admitted to himself that she was one. His phone buzzed. Lev. Quinn apartment secure. 2 men in vehicle ID'd as Serrano contractors. Detained. He put the phone in his pocket. Got in the car. Looked at Valentina, who was looking back at him with her father's eyes. You knew about Serrano before tonight, she said. Not accusing. Assessing. I knew his name, Cassian said. I didn't know his timeline. He's been watching you for a year, she said. At least. He looked at her. How do you know that? Because my father's had the same suspicion for 6 months, and he didn't act on it because he didn't have enough. She held his gaze. You have enough now. The question is what you do before he resets and tries again. Cassian looked through the windshield at the gray-blue of the approaching dawn. He did have enough now. He had the financial structure, the shell companies, the logistics of the abduction, the identities of 2 contractors who were currently in Lev's custody and would, under the right conditions, become very forthcoming about the rest of the organization. He had enough to build a case. He had enough to move. What he also had was the understanding, sitting cold and specific in his chest, that Serrano had planned for the possibility of exposure. That a man this patient did not construct an 8-month operation without a contingency for the moment it came apart. The contingency would be something irreversible. And Cassian, staring at the dawn with Dominic Morelli's daughter in his car and Ilara Quinn locked in her bedroom 2 miles away, understood with a precision that left no room for comfort that the contingency had probably already been set in motion, and that somewhere in the machinery of the next 12 hours there was a move he hadn't seen yet, one that Serrano had been saving precisely because it was the one Cassian would least expect from a man who had spent a year studying. The contingency had a name. Cassian found it in the last file, the one Lev had flagged as low priority because it looked like routine logistics documentation. Shipping manifests for a Serrano-affiliated freight company operating out of the South Harbor. Lev's analyst had pulled it because of a shared directorship with one of the shell companies, not because of the cargo records themselves. The cargo records were what mattered. 3 shipments over 6 weeks, all routed through the same intermediate depot in the Millgate district, a former textile processing plant that had been sitting vacant for 2 years under a holding company that traced back through 4 incorporation layers to a name Cassian had never encountered in connection with Serrano before. Ronan Veyron. Not a shell, not a proxy. Ronan's actual name on a directorship filing attached to a property that Serrano's freight operation had been using as a staging facility. Cassian sat in the back of the car with Valentina quiet beside him, and the file on his phone screen, and felt the whole architecture of it lock into final shape. Ronan had not been a peripheral actor in this. Ronan had been the access point. Serrano had found him, or cultivated him, which was more likely, and used the resentments that Cassian had been carefully managing for 8 years as the foundation for everything else. The inside knowledge of Veyron facilities, the shell company connection that pointed back just enough to be found, the 2 men outside Alar's apartment, who had been deployed by Serrano but directed to that specific address by someone who knew it. Ronan had given Serrano Elara's home address. Cassian put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the passing streets. The city was beginning to wake. Early delivery trucks, the first commuters, the particular gray-gold light of a dawn that didn't know and didn't care what had happened in the dark preceding it. "Change of destination," he said to Theo. Valentina looked at him. "I'm taking you to your father," he said, "but not the residence. Where is he right now?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "He'll be at the port office. He goes there when he can't sleep, and he cannot have slept tonight." "Address." She gave it. Theo adjusted course without a word. Buzzed. Dominic Morelli was 61 years old and looked like a man who had spent those years doing difficult things with his hands. He was broad across the shoulders, gray at the temples, and when he came through the port office door at 5:23 in the morning and saw his daughter standing in the pre-dawn light beside Cassian Veyron, the expression on his face moved through approximately 4 distinct emotional states in under 2 seconds before settling into something that was not quite gratitude and not quite suspicion, but contained elements of both. Valentina walked to her father. He put both arms around her, said nothing, held on for a moment that Cassian looked away from because it was not his. When Morelli looked up, his eyes were dry and his jaw was set. "My office," he said. The office was spare, a working space, not a performance space. A desk, a table, a window looking out over the port's loading infrastructure. Aldo Cruz was there, and 2 of Morelli's senior men, and a woman Cassian didn't recognize who turned out to be Morelli's legal counsel. Valentina sat to her father's left. She had already, in the car, given Cassian permission to share what she'd observed, the masked men, the inside knowledge, the false plates. She repeated it now, precisely and without embellishment, and Cassian watched Dominic Morelli listen to his daughter describe her own abduction with the controlled stillness of a man spending enormous energy on not doing the first thing his instincts demanded. When she finished, Cassian laid out the files. Not all of them. The compressed version, the structure of it, the 8 months, the shell companies, the Ronin connection. The room was quiet when he finished. Morelli looked at him across the table. "You're telling me this was Serrano from the beginning," he said. "Yes." "Using your cousin as the access point." "Yes." "And you came here?" "To me, at 5 in the morning, with my daughter, instead of handling Serrano yourself and burying the rest." "You had a right to know the complete picture before making any decisions," Cassian said. "And I need your cooperation to close this cleanly, which I cannot do unilaterally." Morelli was quiet for a moment. He looked at Valentina, who was looking at Cassian with an expression of careful assessment. "What do you need?" Morelli said. "Everything you have on Serrano's port operations," Cassian said. "And your word that your organization holds position for the next 6 hours while we move." "6 hours," Cruz said from the corner. "You can dismantle Serrano's operation in 6 hours." "I can dismantle the part that matters most," Cassian said. "The Millgate facility. That's where his contingency lives. If he understands that we're talking, that the war he manufactured isn't happening, he'll move to trigger it himself rather than let the opportunity close. He'll move within hours. That facility is where he moves from." Another silence. Morelli looked at his legal counsel. Something passed between them that Cassian didn't try to read. 6 hours, Morelli said. "After that, I move regardless." "I'll be done in 4, Cassian said. The problem was Ronan. Ronan was not at his apartment. Lev's 2 men, who had been watching the building since last night, reported that he had left at 2 a.m., 2 hours after the parking garage, an hour before Cassian had called about the Eastfield facility, and had not returned. His phone was off. His car was at the apartment, which meant he'd left in something else, or with someone else. Cassian processed this in the car on the way to the Millgate district with Lev beside him, and 8 men in 2 vehicles behind, and the processing produced a singular cold conclusion. Ronan knew the operation had been exposed. He had been warned. which meant Serrano had a communication channel to Ronan that had activated the moment something went wrong, and Ronan was now either running or being extracted. Either possibility was a problem. A running Ronan was a loose variable with intimate knowledge of the Veyron organization. An extracted Ronan was Serrano's insurance, proof of the Veyron-adjacent conspiracy, usable if Serrano needed to muddy the legal waters or generate enough chaos to escape the closing trap. Cassian's phone buzzed. Elara. He answered. "You should be asleep," he said. "I found something." Her voice was alert, no morning roughness in it, which meant she hadn't slept at all. "Your men are outside." "I'm fine, but I've been going through Ronan's calendar, the shared executive calendar he had access to when he was still using your building. There's a property listing, a private booking, 2 days ago, under a vendor name, the Kellard Arms." The Kellard Arms was the residential hotel in the Meridian district. Old building, discreet management, the kind of place that asked no questions about its long-term guests. "How did you access that calendar?" he said. "You gave me administrator access to the executive systems in my second week," she said. "I've always had it." "And you've been sitting on that capability for 3 months." "I've been using it to do scheduling," she said. "Tonight I used it for something else." He almost said something about that, decided to put it aside. "Good work," he said. "Stay inside." He ended the call and looked at Lev. "Split the team, 4 to Millgate, 4 to the Kellard Arms Meridian District. Ronan is in one of the 2. "Which one do you want?" "Millgate," Cassian said. "What?" The Millgate facility was dark from the outside. A 3-story former textile plant with boarded ground floor windows and a loading dock that had been retrofitted with modern security hardware that looked, to a casual observer, like the standard equipment on any commercial storage facility. To someone who had spent 20 years reading the physical vocabulary of operational spaces, it looked like exactly what it was, a working installation trying to present as dormant. There were 3 vehicles in the rear lot. Cassian looked at them from the tree line at the property's eastern edge. Lev was on his right. The 4 men were spread in pairs, covering the north and south approaches. 3 vehicles means 6 to 12 people inside, Lev said quietly. "More than I expected," Cassian said. He moved fast. He had the contingency ready to activate. He looked at the building. He's been waiting for exactly this scenario, for us to find enough to move against him. "So this is the trap," Lev said. "This is where the trap was supposed to close," Cassian said. "We're going to spring it from the outside instead of the inside." He pulled out his phone, dialed a number he had used exactly twice before in his professional life. A contact at the Federal Organized Crime Task Force, a man named Hartley, who had been building a Serrano file for 3 years, and who had, on both previous occasions, demonstrated the specific brand of pragmatism that made him useful. Hartley answered on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant he had already heard something. "Veyron," Hartley said, "I've been expecting your call for about 2 hours. How much do you have on the Millgate property?" "Enough to move, not enough to hold without cooperation." "I can give you cooperation," Cassian said. "I can give you financial records, shell company documentation, testimony from 2 Serrano contractors currently in my people's custody, and the direct connection between Serrano and the Morelli abduction tonight. In exchange, the operation closes on Serrano specifically. Anything adjacent is handled separately." A pause. Adjacent meaning Veyron-affiliated individuals. Adjacent meaning one specific Veyron-affiliated individual whose cooperation with Serrano was obtained under circumstances your office will find relevant to culpability assessments. Another pause. Longer. "I need that documentation in my hands before I move on Millgate," Hartley said. "You'll have it in 40 minutes, Cassian said. "The facility will still be there. And if Serrano moves before 40 minutes, then Lev handles it," Cassian said, "and you process the paperwork afterward." He ended the call. Lev looked at him. "The federal angle keeps it clean," Cassian said. "Serrano goes through the system. The evidence holds. There's no question of a Veyron reprisal, no justification for anyone to come back at the organization later. And if Serrano's inside that building and he decides to move in the next 40 minutes, then we contain him until Hartley arrives." Cassian looked at the facility. "Nobody goes in. Nobody comes out." 22 minutes in, the loading dock doors opened. Cassian saw it from the tree line. The roll of the steel door, the rectangle of yellow interior light. Two men came out first, moving with the specific, purposeful speed of people executing a prepared exit, not a panic. A third man followed, carrying a hard case. And then Serrano himself. Cassian had seen photographs. The reality was less remarkable than the photographs suggested. A lean man of medium height in his mid-30s, dark coat, moving with his eyes already scanning the perimeter. He was smart enough to know the facility was compromised. He was leaving. He was not going to make it to 40 minutes. "Lev," Cassian said, "I see them. Contain. Don't engage unless they move toward a vehicle." They moved toward a vehicle. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not clean. It was 4 minutes of contained chaos in a dark rear lot. Lev's men cutting off the vehicle access points. Serrano's people reacting with the aggression of cornered professionals. The particular brutal arithmetic of bodies in a confined space with no clean exits, and everyone very clear about what the stakes were. Cassian was in it. He had not intended to be in it personally, but the geometry of the lot collapsed the option of remaining at the perimeter. Two of Serrano's men pushed through toward the eastern tree line, and Cassian was there. And what followed was immediate and physical, and not something he would reconstruct later with any pleasure. He took a hit to the left ribs from an elbow that landed at exactly the wrong angle, and felt something shift in a way that was going to be significantly more painful in approximately 4 hours when the adrenaline cleared. He didn't let it slow him. He put the man down with 2 precise strikes and kept moving. Serrano was at the second vehicle, one hand on the door handle, his driver behind the wheel, engine running. Cassian reached him before the door opened. He got his hand on Serrano's collar and pulled him back from the door with enough force that the man's feet left the ground briefly. And then Serrano was against the side of the vehicle, and Cassian's forearm was across his chest, and they were face to face for the first time, close enough that Cassian could hear the man's breathing. Fast, controlled, furious. Serrano looked at him. He wasn't afraid. That was the thing Cassian registered immediately. Not fear in the eyes, but something colder, more considered. The look of someone running calculations even now. "You can't hold me," Serrano said. His voice was even. "You don't have legal authority, you have a conflict of interest the size of this city, and anything your people have on me was obtained through methods that won't—" "Partly," Cassian said. A beat. Serrano's eyes changed. "Federal task force," Cassian said. 3 years of their own documentation plus everything I handed them 40 minutes ago. You're not being held by me." He stepped back, just slightly. "You're being held for them." The federal vehicles came through the north gate 30 seconds later. Hartley was in the first one. He was a tall man in his 40s with the permanent tiredness of someone who had been chasing this specific case for longer than anyone had officially sanctioned. And when he looked at Cassian across the lot, there was a particular quality of professional acknowledgement between them. Not warmth, not alliance, just the mutual recognition of two people who had, in a narrow window of shared interest, gotten something done. "Serrano," Hartley said to his agents. They moved. Serrano went without physical resistance, which was its own kind of statement. The calculation of a man who had already begun building his legal defense and understood that the building started with what he did in the next 60 seconds. He looked back at Cassian once as they walked him toward the federal vehicle. "The Quinn woman," he said. "Ronan told me you'd burn everything for her." I didn't believe him. Cassian looked at him. "He was right," Serrano said. And there was something in it that was not quite admiration, but was the closest thing to it that a man like Serrano could produce. The acknowledgement of a variable he had studied and underestimated. The federal vehicle door closed. Cassian stood in the lot with his hand pressed against his left ribs, and the sky going from deep blue to the first pale wash of genuine morning, and his phone buzzing in his pocket, and Lev at his elbow saying something about the Kellard Arms, about Ronan in custody, about the federal team picking him up on site, about cooperation being offered in exchange for terms. He heard it, filed it, dealt with it in the part of his mind that dealt with logistics. The other part of his mind was somewhere else. His phone kept buzzing. He looked at the screen. Ilara. He answered. "It's over," he said, before she could ask. Because she would ask, and she had earned the answer before the question. Silence on the line. The particular texture of someone absorbing news they had been holding their breath for. "Are you hurt?" she said. He pressed his free hand against his ribs. "No." A pause. She knew what his pauses meant by now. "Cassian." "I'll live," he said. "That's not a no." "No," he said. "It's not." Another silence, but different from the first, shorter, more resolved, the silence of someone who had already made up their mind about something before the conversation started. "I'm coming to you," she said. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." Her voice was steady. Not the performed steadiness he'd learned to recognize as armor. Something underneath the armor. Something that had decided the armor was temporarily optional. "Tell me where you are." He looked around at the lot. The federal vehicles, Lev organizing the handoff of the contractors, the Millgate facility with its lights on and its doors open, and the whole careful machinery of Serrano's 8-month construction being systematically disassembled around him, and felt the adrenaline beginning its slow retreat and the pain in his ribs asserting itself with increasing specificity and the particular quality of exhaustion that came not from physical effort, but from the sustained compression of caring about something you couldn't fully. She found him sitting on the hood of Theo's car. That was the thing she would remember later. Not the federal vehicles, not the industrial wreckage of the lot, not the particular gray gold of the early morning light spreading itself across a sky that had no idea what had happened beneath it through the night. She would remember Cassian Veyron, the most controlled man she had ever encountered in her life, sitting on the hood of a car with his jacket off, and his left hand pressed flat against his ribs, and his head tipped back slightly, eyes closed, just breathing. She had taken a cab. She had stood on the street outside her locked apartment at 5:50 in the morning and flagged down the first cab she saw and given the driver the address Cassian had given her, and she had spent the 15-minute ride with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the passing city and the specific quality of stillness inside her chest that came not from calm but from the temporary cessation of fear. The fear had been there all night. She was done pretending otherwise. She came through the north gate. One of Lev's men waved her through without question, which meant Cassian had told someone she was coming. And she crossed the lot and she stopped in front of him and looked at him for a moment before she said anything. His shirt was torn at the left shoulder. There was blood at his hairline, dried, not fresh. The hand against his ribs was pressing with more intention than a person pressed against something that didn't hurt. "Let me see," she said. He opened his eyes, looked at her. The particular quality of his gaze in that moment, stripped of the professional distance, stripped of the careful management, just the exhaustion and something underneath it that had been there since September and had not once diminished, was something she held and did not look away from. "I'm fine," he said. "That's the answer you give other people," she said. A beat. She watched something move through his expression, recognition, and underneath it something that might have been the particular vulnerability of being handed your own words back by someone who had been paying attention. He moved his hand from his ribs. She stepped forward and pressed careful fingers to his left side, through the shirt, and felt him tighten against the contact. Not pulling away, but holding. She found the specific point where his breath changed and pressed gently and felt the quality of the injury through the fabric. "Cracked," she said. "At least one." "Possibly. You need imaging." "Later." "Cassian." "Later," he said again, and the word was not dismissive but final, in the specific way that meant his hierarchy of concerns had other items ahead of his own body, and she recognized that hierarchy because she had spent the last several years living inside the same one. She stepped back, looked at him, looked at the lot, the federal presence, Lev moving between clusters of men with his habitual economy of motion, the Millgate facility with its doors open and its secrets extracted and laid out under the morning sky for people with badges to catalog and process. "It's done," she said. "Serrano's in federal custody. Ronan—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "Ronan is at the Kellard Arms. My men found him. He's cooperating with Hartley's office." Cooperating. Trading what he knows about Serrano's operation for considerations on his own exposure. He said it flatly. "He'll serve time. Less than he should. More than he wants." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you—" She stopped, started again. He's your family. He made choices, Cassian said. Family is not immunity from choices. I know that. She did know it. She knew it with the specific knowledge of someone who had spent years cleaning up choices made by the man who was supposed to protect her. I just wanted to know if you were all right about it. He looked at her. No, he said, simply, without performance. I'm not all right about it. She nodded. That honesty cost him something, and she received it with the appropriate weight. My father, she said, is fine. His situation is finished. There's no debt to collect because the lending operation is being absorbed into the federal case as a Serrano-affiliated asset. Whatever Ronan built on your family's back gets dismantled by people with subpoenas. Your father doesn't owe anyone anything. She heard that sentence and stood inside it for a moment. The particular shape of it, the weight of what it meant for Maya's tuition, for the second mortgage, for the specific quality of dread that had lived in her chest since she was 23 years old and first understood exactly how deep her father had dug. Gone. Like a number on a page that someone had simply crossed out. She pressed her lips together, held on. Don't, he said quietly. I'm not. You almost are. I said I'm not. She looked up at the sky and breathed once, all the way down. Then she looked at him. Thank you. He said nothing. He was looking at her with the same quality of attention he had always given her. Total, precise, patient. And she understood in that moment what she had been doing with that attention for 3 months. She had been receiving it and cataloging it and building a careful architecture of professional distance around it because the alternative was something she didn't know how to afford. She was not sure she could afford it now either. But she was also standing in a parking lot at 6 in the morning, having spent the night locked in her bedroom listening to the sounds of her city, while the man in front of her had spent that same night dismantling an 8-month conspiracy. And the architecture of professional distance felt, in this particular light, like something that had already come down. You told me to come back in the morning, she said, and we'd talk about the rest. He looked at her. It's morning, she said. They didn't talk about the rest that morning. They didn't talk about it in the car on the way to the hospital, where an emergency room physician confirmed 2 cracked ribs and one that was borderline, taped him accordingly, and recommended rest in a tone that suggested she understood exactly how seriously that recommendation would be taken. They didn't talk about it in the lobby while Lev handled the discharge paperwork and Theo brought the car around. They didn't talk about it on the way to the Veyron estate, which Cassian directed Theo toward without explanation, or when Alara got out of the car and followed him inside without being asked, because she had been awake for 26 hours and had nowhere else she wanted to be. She slept in a guest room on the 2nd floor with the door open. She didn't know why she left the door open. She told herself it was habit and did not examine the claim. She woke at 2 in the afternoon to the sound of rain. Woke him. He was in the kitchen when she came downstairs. Not at the table, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, looking out the window at the rain coming down across the estate's back garden. He had changed clothes. The taped ribs were invisible under a clean gray shirt, but she could see the care in how he stood, the slight adjustment of his posture that compensated for the injury. He heard her come in and turned. She was wearing the same clothes from the night before, which she was aware of, and her hair was loose because her elastic had snapped at some point in the cab and she hadn't had anything to replace it with, and she looked, she suspected, like someone who had spent a significant portion of the last 24 hours being afraid. She sat down at the kitchen table. He put a cup of coffee in front of her without asking. She wrapped both hands around it. I've been thinking about what you said, she said, in the office, about protection. He sat down across from her. The table was old wood, warm-toned. The rain made its sound against the window. You said you wanted me to let someone protect me. She looked at the coffee. I've been doing the opposite of that for so long, I'm not sure I know what the other thing looks like. I know, he said. I don't mean physically, I mean in general. She looked up. My mother died when I was 17, and my father is a good man who makes catastrophic decisions and loves us completely, and those things somehow coexist in the same person, and Maya was 12, and I made a decision that year about who was responsible for what, and I've been executing that decision ever since. 11 years, he said. 11 years. She looked at him. I'm tired. He said nothing. He let the words sit without filling the space they created, which was one of the things she had noticed about him first. The ability to leave room for something to be what it was without immediately converting it into something manageable. In the parking garage last night, she said, when Ronan... She stopped, started again. When you came through those elevator doors, I wasn't relieved. I mean, I was, but that wasn't the first thing. The first thing was... She stopped again, because the first thing was still sitting in her chest in a way that was difficult to language without becoming something she hadn't decided to become yet. What was the first thing? He said. She looked at him across the old wooden table with the rain on the glass and the coffee going warm between her hands. I thought, there he is, she said. That was the first thing. Just, there he is. Like you being there was a fact I already knew and had been waiting for confirmation of. The room was very quiet. Cassian looked at her with an expression she had catalogued once, in September, through the glass partition of his office. The expression of a man managing something that didn't want to be managed, that was larger than the container he'd built for it. I have not, he said, carefully, handled this well. Handled what? The fact that I... He stopped. Put the coffee cup down. The deliberation of the gesture, the precision of it, the care, was so characteristic of him that she almost smiled. I noticed you before I had grounds to notice you, before I knew anything about Ronan or your father or any of it. I noticed the long sleeves and the way you looked directly at me in the interview, and the way you moved through this building, like you were trying to take up as little space as possible while also doing everything correctly. And I... He stopped. And? She said. And I kept it where it belonged, he said. Behind glass. I told myself I was being professional. I was also being afraid, which is not something I am often willing to admit. You were afraid, she said. I run a criminal organization, he said. I have not, historically, been a person who allows people close enough to matter. The one time I allowed something close enough to matter, I was 22, and it ended in a way that... It ended badly. He said it without elaboration, and she received it without asking, because some things were volunteered and some things were earned, and this was not the moment for either of them to demand more than the other was offering. I built very good systems after that, for keeping things at the appropriate distance. And then I walked in with long sleeves, she said. And then you walked in with long sleeves, he said, and looked directly at me, and asked for nothing, and were exactly what you presented yourself as, which is something that happens with so little frequency in my world that I didn't know what to do with it except pay attention. She looked at him. I'm not a simple proposition, she said. I come with a father who makes catastrophic decisions, and a sister I will always put first, and a job history that now includes being used as an intelligence asset by your cousin, and I know what you come with, he said. I'm telling you anyway. I know. I'm listening. She looked at him for a long moment. The rain outside was steady, unhurried. The kitchen was warm. Through the window, the garden was silver gray and private. What do you want? She said. The non-professional version. He held her gaze. You, he said. Just the word. No architecture around it. It was not simple. Nothing about the weeks that followed was simple, and later she would think that was the thing that made it real. The absence of simplicity, the presence of friction and negotiation, and the specific difficulty of two people who had both spent years constructing elaborate systems of self-sufficiency, now having to make room for each other inside those systems. There were conversations about her father that were not comfortable. Dennis Quinn came to the estate once, a Tuesday in October, and sat across from Cassian in the living room with the particular humility of a man who understood exactly the size of what he owed and had no currency to pay it with except honesty. The conversation lasted an hour. Alara sat in the adjoining room and did not listen and also heard everything. At the end of it, her father came and found her and held her for a long moment without speaking, which was how Dennis Quinn apologized for things that were too large for words. She let him. She held on. She moved out of the Claridge apartment in November. Maya helped her pack and was aggressively cheerful about it in the way of someone who had strong opinions she was tactfully not voicing, and at one point she looked at Alara over a box of books and said, "He looks at you like you're the only stable thing in a room." And Alara said, "Don't." And Maya said, "I'm just saying." And that was the end of the conversation, and also not the end of it at all. The estate had a room that had been a study and became, gradually and without explicit negotiation, Alara's workspace. She kept her job. He kept her as his executive assistant in the technical sense, which meant very little changed about the daily work and a great deal changed about everything surrounding it. His people adjusted. Some of them adjusted with more grace than others. Lev, characteristically, said nothing about anything and continued to be exactly as laconic and competent as he had always been, which she interpreted as approval. The Serrano federal case moved forward with the methodical pace of federal cases. Hartley called Cassian twice with updates, and once to request documentation that Cassian provided without conditions and without being asked twice. Serrano was denied bail. The shell company structure was being forensically disassembled by a team of prosecutors who appeared to find the process genuinely interesting, which Alara, when Cassian told her this, found both reassuring and slightly unnerving. Ronan pled to reduce charges in December. He was sentenced in February. Cassian attended the sentencing. He didn't tell Alara he was going, and she didn't tell him she knew. She'd seen it on the calendar, the blocked 2 hours on a Thursday morning, no description. When he came back, he was quieter than usual for the rest of the day. And in the evening, she sat beside him on the couch in the estate's main room, while he read something and she read something, and neither of them spoke about it. And she reached over at one point and put her hand over his on the cushion between them, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And that was the whole conversation. Valentina Morelli sent a package in March. It arrived at the estate on a Tuesday morning, small, wrapped in plain paper, addressed in handwriting that was confident and slightly impatient in its character, like the woman herself. Alara opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a silver bracelet, fine chain, a small rectangular plate. She turned it over, engraved on the back, in small clean letters, "For the woman who taught me what courage looks like." She sat with it for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, the garden was beginning to show the first tentative evidence of spring. Something green at the base of the stone wall, the particular pale quality of light that belonged to March mornings when the season hadn't committed yet. She heard him on the stairs, heard the particular cadence of his steps, which she knew now the way she had learned the cadence of his moods and his silences, and the specific quality of his attention when he was working through something difficult. He came into the kitchen, saw her at the table, saw the bracelet. He didn't ask. He came and sat beside her, not across from her, and looked at it. She turned it over so he could read the engraving. He read it, looked at her. "Valentina has strong opinions," he said. "She's not wrong," Alara said. "No," he said. "She's not." She held the bracelet out to him. Not to give it back, Jan. He understood that immediately, could read the gesture for what it was. She wanted him to put it on her. The specificity of that, the asking for that particular thing in that particular way, cost her something in the currency of the self-sufficiency she had spent 11 years accumulating. She spent it anyway. He took the bracelet from her hand. He reached for her wrist, her left wrist, the one that had carried Ronan's fingerprints in September, the one she had finally stopped hiding in October and then stopped thinking about in December and now offered without calculation in March. And he fastened the clasp with the careful attention he gave to everything. His thumb moved across her wrist once, very slightly. The same wrist. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't have to. She looked at the bracelet, silver against her skin, light and present. She turned her wrist over and looked at the back of it the way you looked at something you wanted to memorize. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When you said you'd have been afraid," she said, "of letting something matter, I understood that. I understood it specifically, not generally." She looked at him. "I have been running the logistics of other people's lives for so long that I had stopped believing my own life was something I was allowed to want things inside of. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly. Just the steady accumulation of evidence that what I was for was useful, and useful was enough." He was looking at her with the total attention, the kind that didn't require her to perform or abbreviate. "You made me want things," she said. "That was inconvenient. I was not in a position to want things. And now," he said, "and now I'm telling you," she said, "which is the thing I do instead of wanting things privately and managing the want into something I can file away." "You're getting better at it," he said. "At what?" "Letting things be what they are." She looked at him, felt the particular quality of the moment, the kitchen, the March light, the bracelet on her wrist, the man across from her who had spent a year paying attention and several months doing something considerably more complicated than that. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she did most things, directly, without preamble, without the softening that sometimes preceded difficult truths. "I'm telling you because I've been sitting with it for long enough that it's either tell you or carry it indefinitely, and I am tired of carrying things indefinitely." He looked at her for a moment that was not long but felt thorough. "I know," he said. "That's what you said about everything else," she said. "In September, I know, as though you'd already—" "I had," he said. "I've known since October, possibly September." He paused. "The knowing wasn't the difficult part." "What was the difficult part?" "Deserving it," he said. Simply, without performance. The admission of a man who did not traffic in self-pity, but was capable, apparently, of an honesty about himself that cost him something real. "What I do. What this life is. I know what I am, Ilara. I know the specific weight of it. Wanting you in it required me to believe you could carry that weight and had chosen to not been maneuvered into it, not been placed here by someone else's agenda. You needed to know it was my choice." "Yes." She looked at him. "It was always my choice. From the first week. Whatever Ronan thought he was engineering, I chose to be here. I chose you." He reached across the table, put his hand on her face. A gesture she had not expected from him. Not this particular tenderness. His palm against her jaw, his thumb at the line of her cheekbone. And he looked at her with the expression she had catalogued in September and understood in November, and now could read completely. A man who had spent a very long time building walls, discovering that one specific person had been on the inside of them the entire time. "I love you," he said. The three words in his voice had the quality of something that had been true for a long time finally being spoken aloud. Not a declaration. An admission. She put her hand over his. Outside the window, the garden was pale and quiet. The March light moved across the kitchen floor. Somewhere in the estate, a door opened and closed. Lev, or one of the security staff, the ordinary mechanics of a day beginning, they stayed where they were. Pas. The months that followed were not without difficulty. That was the true version, the one she would have given anyone who asked, which almost no one did because the outside view of their life was simply the Veyron estate and the Veyron organization and the executive assistant who had become something else. And most people filled in the rest with whatever story made sense to them. The true version included her father's slow, uneven work toward accountability. The therapy he started in April and quit in May and restarted in June. The Tuesday dinners at the estate that were sometimes warm and sometimes uncomfortable and always real. The incremental repair of something that had been damaged for so long it had begun to look like the original architecture. The true version included Maya's graduation in June from Dunmore Community College. The way she walked across the stage with the specific confidence of someone who had been given room to become herself and had taken it seriously, and the way Ilara cried in the audience in the honest, undignified way of someone who had stopped managing her own reactions quite so rigorously. The true version included Cassian on the phone at 2 a.m. with lawyers, with Hartley, with the ongoing machinery of a legal case that moved at its own pace, regardless of anyone's personal timeline, and the fact that she learned to sleep through those calls and not ask about them and wait until he came back to bed and told her what he chose to tell her, which was more than she expected and less than everything, which was the correct amount. The true version included one night in July when she woke at 3 and couldn't find him, and went downstairs and found him at the window. The same posture from the office in September, the same quality of looking at the city, and she stood in the doorway and didn't say anything. And after a moment he said, "I keep thinking about Ronan at 20. What different decisions would have looked like?" And she went and stood beside him at the window, and they looked at the city together, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would change what had happened, and he didn't need her to change it, only to stand beside him while he sat with it. That was most of what love was, she had decided. Not resolution, just presence. The willingness to stand beside someone in the dark, and not require the dark to become light on any particular schedule. In August, Valentina Morelli called her directly, not through Cassian, not through any organizational channel, just a number Valentina had apparently obtained through methods that Ilara decided not to examine closely. They had coffee on a Thursday. Valentina was sharp and direct, and slightly overwhelming in the specific way of people who had been through something and come out the other side with no patience left for performance. "He's different," Valentina said, meaning Cassian, over a cup of espresso she drank, standing up because she didn't like to sit still in public places. "I've known him adjacently for years. He's different now." "Different how?" Ilara said. Valentina looked at her. "Less careful. In the good way. People who are too careful are protecting themselves. He's protecting something else now." Ilara looked at the coffee cup in her hands. "Is that—" She stopped. "Does that concern you, from an operational perspective?" Valentina considered this with the genuine seriousness of someone who took operational perspectives seriously. "No," she said finally. "My father says the most dangerous version of Cassian Veyron was always the one who had nothing to lose. The version that has something to lose is more predictable. Predictable is easier to build alliances with." Ilara looked at her. "That's a very practical way to think about it." "I'm a practical person," Valentina said. Then with a shift in register that was subtle but real. "Also, he looks at you the way my father looked at my mother, which is not a practical observation, which is why I'm making it to you instead of to him." She finished her espresso, left. Ilara sat with her coffee in the quiet of the cafe and looked at the bracelet on her left wrist and thought about the woman who had taught someone what courage looked like, which was apparently her, which she was still in the process of believing. On a Tuesday in late September, exactly 1 year from the morning Cassian had looked at the bruise on her wrist and said nothing. She arrived at the office at 7:45, same time as always. Old habit. She had kept the job because she was good at it, and because she had decided a long time ago that being good at things was its own form of dignity, and she was not interested in surrendering it. She was wearing a short-sleeved blouse, navy blue, cotton, the sleeves ending just above the elbow. It was the 3rd week of September, and the temperature had finally started to drop, and the short sleeves were not a statement and not an event. They were just what she wore because the bruises that had once lived under the long ones were gone, had been gone for months, and she had run out of reasons to cover what wasn't there anymore. She set his coffee on his desk. He was already in. He was usually already in. And he was at the window, which was where she had first seen him standing when she understood that this was not a man who was simple to know or simple to love, just a man who was worth the effort of both. He turned when she came in. His eyes went to her arms immediately, not with alarm but with the specific attentiveness of someone who had once cataloged what was hidden there, and now cataloged what wasn't. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. She set the briefing folder beside the coffee. He was still looking at her. "You have the Hartley call at 9, she said, "and the Morelli Development Review at 11. I moved the 2 o'clock to Thursday because the Larkfield documentation still isn't complete." "Thank you," he said. "The weather's going to turn this week. The garden people want to come Friday." "Fine." She picked up the empty coffee cup from yesterday that she'd forgotten to take out last night, because she sometimes forgot small things, and had decided this was allowed. She was at the door when he said her name. She stopped, turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had learned to read completely, the one that meant something was true and he had decided to say it, which was not a decision he made casually or often. "Every battle I ever won," he said, "meant nothing. Not a single one." He said it without self-pity and without drama, just the flat fact of it, the thing he had apparently been sitting with since September of last year, and had finally found the words for. This means something. She stood in his office doorway with yesterday's coffee cup in her hand, and the September light coming through the window behind him, and the whole accumulated weight of the year between them. The bruises and the parking garage, and the federal case and the Tuesday dinners, and the night at the window, and the bracelet and the coffee, and all the 10,000 ordinary moments that were the actual substance of a life rather than its dramatic highlights. And she felt it settle in her chest the way things settled when they were finally exactly where they were supposed to be. "I know," she said, and she did.